Brilliant. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this week's Trending Treasury with Shailendra Shah from M&G talking to us about income strips, and Mark Swallow, one of the strategic directors at Arlen Close. Good morning to you both. Thank you for joining us, Shay. Let's kick off.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and thanks, Shay. Thanks for joining us this morning. So, Shay, you're from M&G. Can you give us a bit of a background on M&G and where you sit in terms of the income strip market, if that's possible, please? Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you both for the introduction. So thanks a lot for this opportunity for letting me sort of talk through sort of what an income strip is. Hopefully over the next sort of half an hour I can sort of demystify what that term is. Obviously it's a form of finance that's been around for quite a while now, but I want to sort of just go through sort of the nuts and bolts of how it could work, particularly for local authorities clearly, and how it could be used as a potential form of finance for in-borough regeneration schemes. So if we go to, I think the first slide actually, but just as a bit of background, my actual presentation will be just a few things. Look, firstly, who is M&G? Secondly, just to talk about why an income strip. Thirdly, what is an income strip, i.e. the mechanics, and then to put a little bit of more colour on that, some examples that we've worked on, and then finally some questions from yourselves and anyone else who's listening to this. So M&G, for those that don't know, M&G is essentially the old Prudential. We demerged a few years ago, and now our new PLC name is M&G PLC. M&G has been around for a long time, and we were always the asset management arm of M&G. But essentially, we are a FTSE 100 company, insurance company with a huge asset management arm. And if we go to the next slide. So I work in the real estate income team, which is essentially a joint venture between our fixed income teams and our real estate teams. The best way I sort of describe my day job is really that, is essentially to deploy clients' capital to create structures that look, smell and feel like bonds, the fixed income side, but just happen to be secured on real estate, i.e. a lease. That's essentially, what we're trying to do. But I suppose from a question from that arises, whom do we do that for and where does our clients' capital come from? So if we go to the next slide. Generally, all of our clients are either the old Prudential, our annuities fund, or institutional investors who generally are based in the UK and are defined benefit pension schemes. What they really want is high quality cash flows to match their pension fund liabilities. So very simply, they will allocate their capital to us, we will manage it for them, and we will go and source high quality cash flows to essentially pay the fund, to essentially then pay the pensioners. That's really sort of the day job. And one of the potential sources of demand for this capital is local authorities, whom are seeking to undertake large complex regeneration schemes. So as examples, despite the current budgetary pressures for local authorities, they still want to provide suitable office accommodation for staff and local businesses, improve town centre facilities in the public realm, and also meet social housing needs. One of the big areas to talk about is potentially the demand for social housing and how an income strip structure with other sources of capital could be used to provide these sorts of developments.
Can I just ask, Shay, the term income strip is a term that we've become familiar with over the last few years, but it's a word that perhaps some people are still unfamiliar what actually income strip means. I'm old enough to remember the term sale and leaseback. Income strip is similar but different to that, but it's one of those words that really, what does it actually mean in terms of what you're trying to do, and where does the income and what is the strip effectively?
Yeah, no, good question. That kind of leads on to the next slide, Mark. So I think one thing I mentioned, and you make a good point about sale and leaseback. So a key distinction between an income strip and a sale and leaseback is at the end of the term, the original lease term, the asset reverts back to the original party. So in this instance, it would be the local authority. We've used this type of structure as well with other parts of the public sector, central government. So one of our client funds owns the Supreme Court on Parliament Square. The freehold is owned by the central government. There's an intermediary interest to the client fund, and then it's let to the Ministry of Justice. But in the next, I think in 17 years' time, no matter what happens, as long as the government pays the rent, which shouldn't be a problem, that we just disappear. So that's the key distinction. In terms of the actual structure then, Mark, this is how it generally works. Basically, there are three sort of key parties involved in the income structure. The fund, as we described, provides the capital to actually develop the scheme, to fund the scheme. The developer is responsible for the actual development on time and on budget, and the key point to mention is they take the delivery risk on that. And then finally, the local authority will effectively understand and recognise exactly the scheme that they'd like to deliver on that, but they will then take a pre-let on the actual structure, making sure that the fund is responsible for the payments and the developer does the actual works. When all the rents have been paid at the end of the lease term, or the property or the asset has been finished, the real estate reverts back to the local authority. In some instances, if the actual building is not for the own occupation of the actual local authority, i.e. a civic office, it could be a social housing scheme, it could be a town centre regeneration scheme, there are generally subtenants, and those subtenants can pay rent, will pay rent up to local authority, can help service the debt, and in some instances, of course, provide a valuable cash flow for the local authority's provision of services.
So effectively, the term income strip is effectively a local authority is using that income over the next 20 to 50 years and effectively selling that up front for a capital sum that it can use to either buy an asset, develop an asset, and it's, in theory, using the income from the subtenants to pay the fund back effectively. So yes. You're stripping the income out from the asset over the life.
Yeah, so it's the best way to think about it. It's a delivery mechanism for developing some form of regeneration, social housing, and the capital will come from the fund, our clients. The developer will take the responsibility, as I say, for making sure that the building is being built, and then a local authority will then, if the scheme is viable longer term, can benefit from some kind of profit rent and additional cash flow above and beyond the rental payments back to the fund.
Okay, great. And does it have to be a new asset, or can a local authority undertake an income strip with an existing asset that has been developed and therefore is effectively just generating cash to use on another, unrelated asset, for instance? Or does it have to be a new development? Is it flexible in that way?
Yeah, I mean, generally, from our clients' perspective, we're looking for high quality cash flows, and therefore clearly a local authority does meet those requirements. We prefer to do it on regeneration schemes where there is an underlying need for that actual asset, but of course, if it's effectively a refinance of an existing in-borough asset that is cash flow generating, of course we could do that structure.
I think there's a couple of questions that come in from viewers of the webcast, which on your slide it says 20 to 50 year lease. Is 20 years the minimum term, 50 years the maximum? So somewhere in between can be funded via this mechanism.
Yeah. So typically the durations that we've done are typically 35 to 50 years, and that's working with the NHS, universities, and in particular local authorities. In some instances, we have done a 20-year transaction just because that's what the entity wanted for various reasons, because there's an underlying contract. But it comes down to effectively the viability of the scheme. Of course, the initial yield or the initial cost of capital on the face of it seems cheaper at day one if you've got longer duration, but of course the overall rate is the same. But our, as I say, if you think about whom we are doing this for, it's effectively pensioners. So doing a 100-year deal is fine, but generally we're there to meet liabilities, and pensioners don't tend to live beyond, certainly not that age, because they're pensioners already.
Great. So that's a great introduction to income strips, what they are, how they work. So have you got any examples of any structures that have been undertaken, particularly in the local authority market? Because I think obviously that's where we are getting interest from our clients, because they're being approached mainly by developers who are looking to bring schemes on stream, and they're using income strips as the funding mechanism. So are there any examples that you can sort of share with us where you have done schemes, either, you mentioned office blocks and you've mentioned regeneration schemes, so it'd be interesting if you could give us some live examples if that's possible.
Yeah, 100%. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is an example of a scheme that we funded in North Wales to provide a new civic office for Conwy County Borough Council. We worked in partnership with Muse Developments and the council and were selected via a formal OG process. The new offices provided much needed and up-to-date Grade A offices for the council's occupation I think consolidated for something like 12 sites from all across the borough to occupy this modern HQ that not only serves their staff but also for the public as well. The lease term, just one of the questions, or the duration, was for 40 years. And at the end, as I said, this asset will revert back to Conwy County Borough Council at the end of the 40-year term. The developer was, as I say, Muse. The contractor was Bowmer and Kirkland, and this scheme was done on time and to budget.
So the council effectively, they used the income strip as a way of funding new offices. They generated savings. They're paying you as the funder 40 years. There's inflation built into that. Obviously, if they'd funded it themselves using Public Works loan borrowing, for instance, then the inflation component is taken out of the equation, isn't it? So that's one of the things that we often ask ourselves, is the fact that there is inflation built into these structures, and that's something that isn't built into fixed term funding. So, but you're saying now on the slide that there's a cap and collar on that inflation, so it's going to rise by RPI, and is it capped at 4% and collared at 2%? And how does that inflation, is that an increase into the rental payment every year, that it rises by inflation over the life of the income strip transaction?
It's exactly that, Mark. That's how generally some things work. And again, sort of, you think about sort of first principles, all of our schemes that give us their capital, our investors, they're all DB pension schemes, which of course they have an obligation to pay their pensions annually, and generally with inflation. So we just try our best to match that for them.
And does it have to be RPI? One of the questions I just seen that's come in is, is it RPI, or can it be CPI, or is it because of the fact that it's linked to pensions, which are generally RPI linked? Is that the inflation mechanism that's preferred by you?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So historically, of course, the world of UK capital markets, because of obviously our government issues gilts in RPI, there's been the most demand for that, and the bulk of the DB pension schemes that invest in our funds have looked for RPI linking. But of course, RPI is disappearing in 2030. So some transactions, we have to obviously factor that into account, that they could be priced in as RPI today, and then there'll have to be a logical switch to ensure that the return that we think we paid for today matches what we did, because obviously 40 years is a long time. Now we're seeing transactions we are working on where we can be, and just effectively get a match for that, so we can look at CPI plus the wedge deals, or CPIH plus the wedge deals. But generally there is still more demand for RPI based instruments or transactions, or something that kind of looks as closely to RPI today and into the future.
Okay, great. So an office accommodation scheme, that's quite interesting. As a local authority, it wants a new asset. It's used the income strip to fund. So that, what other examples? You mentioned regeneration schemes. So I think you might have a slide, a couple of slides, that mentions some of the regeneration schemes you've worked on.
Yeah, sure. If we, just to finish on Colwyn Bay, from their perspective, they wanted to consolidate to Colwyn Bay because as you say, the efficiencies, but also help with not necessarily regenerating the high street indirectly, but also just catalysing the movement there. The refectory in this office, I understand, doesn't serve any food, so people are encouraged to either obviously bring their own food, but actually perhaps take. So there's sort of some positive indirect consequences to what they were thinking.
Okay. So in terms of regeneration, you've got, I think the next slide gives a bit more detail of a actual town centre where you've worked in conjunction with a local authority to deliver a new town centre.
Yeah, so this is a project we worked with Generate and Rochdale Borough Council to create essentially a new leisure and retail scheme not far from the council's new civic office, anchored by M&S Next and a cinema operator, but it's essentially 200,000 square feet of brand new retail and leisure. Again, it was completed in March 2020, just on time. I think had it been a few months or projected a few months later, it may have taken a little while longer for obvious reasons. The builder's not been able to go on site for a while. But this is a really, really good example of a wider regeneration scheme that's part of a wider master plan. And it was, as I say, completed on time, and it's trading now. So that's a really good example of a local partnership and a final piece, in a sort of a wider jigsaw. The duration of this one is 35 years, the lease term, and the collar is 2 and 5. So again, slightly different to what we agreed on Colwyn Bay, but that's what the council decided to take on.
Okay, great. And so, you've given 2 examples, and I think you've got a next one, which is again another sort of mixed, where it's a regeneration scheme and a office scheme. But you mentioned early in your, and we can talk about that one in a minute, but you mentioned early in your presentation about, you're also interested in affordable housing and social housing. So is there a preference to the type of asset, the sector it's in? So, this is purely a commercial type transaction, whereas housing is a social type transaction, or are you concerned, the covenant of the local authority underwriting the income and the fact that you can get inflation? Is that another issue, or do you, aren't you so fussy, if you see what I mean, about what the underlying asset is? Is it purely the covenant of the tenant and the inflation aspects?
So a couple of principles really. We obviously want to enter into transactions that we feel will be viable for the long term. So if you are taking 35 to 50 year positions, of course things change. Look, if you do a 35-year deal and it goes wrong in year 33, it's probably quite difficult for somebody to sort of foresee that. But if you do something for that duration, it goes wrong in year 2, there has to, you have to look yourself in the eye and think about how that works. So I think one of the key things we think about is, look, what is the headroom? So the cost of effectively our rent, which is effectively term it as debt, and then making sure there's enough headroom between that and what the council could be making for it with regards to rates and rent, to ensure that there's viability of the long term. Take into account, Mark, of course, inflation. So that is a key thing for us. Social housing is a good example. Clearly there is a big demand. Conversely, clearly a big shortage, whichever way you look at it, whichever lens. So from my perspective, because there is lots and lots of underlying cash flows there, which are actually quite robust, they can all be sort of packaged together and are quite robust. That can obviously service an income strip structure. So I think we are having lots of inquiries from a lot of people about how we could help to work on that type of structure in social housing. So I think that's going to be quite an exciting area, I think, for the next.
Yeah. I guess one of the risks around, because obviously you've shown two examples where you've shown an office, and we know now that following the COVID, people's views of office accommodation has changed. So the local authority concerned may not occupy that office to the degree it has done in the past. And then town centre regeneration schemes may have, the way that we visit town centres may have changed. So obviously there's a risk to the local authority there that the income that they perceive to receive may not be as strong now as it was when they entered these deals, but also something that may not be factored in is political changes, because social housing, all the government need to do is to actually say, let's put a cap on rents, or let's actually force rents to fall rather than rise. So I presume that's factored into the options appraisal process around the risks, not only inflation, but about the risks of the income stream itself. And do you want to take that, or is it up to the client to undertake that through the details?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question, actually, Mark. So we've got quite a large transaction on at the moment, and we're hugely rigorous to understand that their business plan and understanding that the underlying asset that is being built, which is actually it's a regional scheme, so it's quite huge. It's quite a unique scheme in terms of what it is, because social housing is quite straightforward to understand, as is an office. This is quite a bespoke regional operational asset, which is hugely exciting. But we spent a lot of time understanding the underlying business plan, that that this specific asset can be operated in the correct manner, and that they have also employed the best operator in the market to do that, because it's such a bespoke asset. So I think we do deeply care about the long-term viability of the underlying scheme. Of course, as you correctly point out, office is a good example that the way we're all working. Example, what we're doing now, this would have been a lecture theatre with Mermaid, this kind of conversation, but things are changing. But again, we do think about from day one, what the viability is. And I think if we go to the next slide, perhaps the next example, if you could sort of talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is another transaction we did. Again, it's another office scheme, but also as well as a town centre regeneration scheme. So it's 2 buildings in Middlesbrough. One's about, I think, 65,000 square feet. One's just north of 30. The original intention and the original investment committee paper was that Middlesbrough were going to occupy the larger building for their own occupation, very similar to what Conwy County Borough Council did in Wales, and they were going to sublet the smaller building. So so obviously we did quite a bit of DD to understand that look, Middlesbrough is not perhaps the most buoyant of office markets. It's not a huge well-known institutional office market, but the thesis behind it was that look, if you build grade A accommodation, they will come. The council then decided, I think, as practical completion was being approached, or post-practical completion, didn't want to occupy for the civic office, and they would take on that letting risk, which they duly did. But with regards to your comment about sort of letting, they have got both the assets 80% let and through COVID, so, some good tenants. So the cost of our rent, if we think about real estate terms, is £7.23 per square foot. When at PC, they're doing deals north of £15. So not only are they generating a cash flow above the actual cost of debt, there's also obviously the empty rates, and they're providing high quality grade A accommodation in Middlesbrough, which perhaps from a traditional real estate institutional market may never have happened.
Okay, so obviously income strips, a form of funding, local authority examples you've given on the previous couple of slides, but we mentioned, I've mentioned PWLB. Now PWLB is price gilts plus 80. Obviously your funding is going to be gilts plus, and I imagine it's more than 80. So why would you consider income strip rather than PWLB? But also, is for some of these developments, they are big numbers, 80 million, 50 million plus. Is there an argument that from a local authority where it can use both forms? So PWLB, income strips, they're not mutually exclusive. Can they be used in conjunction? And what actually drives the pricing of the income strip when we know that PWLB is gilts plus a margin? Is there a similar sort of metric used to your pricing?
Yeah, so I suppose there's two questions there, Mark. I think the first question is, look, are we as an income strip transaction going to be more expensive than a PWLB? Of course it is. We cannot, and institutions cannot compete with central government funding, because obviously it's subsidised is probably the right term, but it's very, 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 very attractive for a local authority for obvious reasons. So we can't compete with that, and that is the big elephant in the room, but it's factual. Where income strips can be useful using private sector financing, of course, it's from a local authority's perspective, it kind of keeps that capacity for PWLB for other things and other requirements, because of course lots of these schemes take years and years and years to sort of get online. I think the second limit of the question in terms of is a transaction exclusive for just income strip financing? No. So we've got a quite large transaction at the moment, which is essentially we are putting in probably, I would say, 70% of the equity, i.e. via an income strip. The council is also putting in the remaining 30% through their own capital and through their own PWLB borrowing to ensure that the scheme gets done. I can envision situations where that elements of the other capital come from the LEPs and this levelling up fund. There could be the High Streets fund. That to me is all positive to make schemes viable.
Great. And again, the examples you've given are all in borough. So what are your views on, because local authorities have been in the news recently about buying assets out of borough to generate income. Would you as an income strip funder be willing to fund those type of transactions, or are you sort of more linked to the regeneration and in borough type funding schemes?
Yeah, so we've taken a fairly sort of robust view in terms of we very much would like to work with the local authority in borough. I think from our perspective, it's working very much along the lines of if one of the benefits of doing an income strip is the land reverts back to the local authority, Middlesbrough Council will not be moving from Middlesbrough. In 35 years' time, they are the custodians and the stewards of their town centre. So whatever the most viable use is for that council, no different to Rochdale, Conwy County Borough Council, they will then decide at that point, okay, if it is another office building, they take all the cash flow, they could do a refinance, or they can build something else on it. So I think from our perspective, we're very, very keen to work with the local authorities in borough. I think one of the and all of the transactions we've done to date have been in borough transactions. One thing we have sort of looked at and are sort of investigating is on social housing. I think where it does become a little bit different, and again, we're just thinking this through, and this hasn't been tested at our investment committees. That, as an example, there are 30 London boroughs, but if a London borough has a social housing requirement that just moves one street across and just happens to be another borough, but it's not them on their list, that's something that we should think carefully about. So so I live in Barnet, but if my council was doing a job in either Enfield to the east or Brent to the west, just because it's one street away, is it going to be a massive difference that it's outside the rules? I'm not sure.
Okay. And in terms of size of transactions, the slides that you've presented have been north of 20 million, but is 20 million a sort of hurdle rate where a local authority needs to have a scheme that is at least that level? Or for instance, a local authority that's looking to potentially deliver social housing via income strip, the sum of all of their housing needs may be north of 20 million, but the actual schemes themselves may be a number of different schemes that equate to 20 million. And are you flexible, or is it just one scheme that you're looking for, or would you sort of part fund and get to that level? If I explain myself there. So is there a sort of hurdle rate, and is it one scheme specific, or can a local authority look to fund their entire capital programme, for instance, via this type of project?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think generally, sort of, because a lot of these are funding transactions, it's a delivery mechanism working with a developer. So everyone needs to ensure that there are protections in place to ensure that the scheme is delivered. Clearly, obviously, we have a duty to our investors to ensure that the capital's not frittered away. So we're very, very careful about the warranty packages, the quality of the contractor, the quality of the developer, the planning requirements, and the quality of the buildings. Increasingly, ESG is hugely important for all of us, and of course for local authorities as well. So if you factor all of those things into account, generally we are looking at schemes that are a minimum of £20 million. I think the second limit of the question, Mark, look, if the overall quantum of the scheme was 20 million, but it was, over say 5 or 6 sites in the borough, yes, you would look at that. But again, I think we'd want to ensure that, say one developer dealing with it, and, essentially one or maybe, split up building contracts. I suppose the other end is, look, we've done transactions that have been sub 20 million, all the way up to some that are, 250.
And the final question from me is that local authorities are good credit. They have got an income stream from local taxpayers and can access the PWV. Where you've I'm not down to give details and actually give full disclosure, but when you've done income strip deals for other government departments, for instance, has the pricing, the local authorities, are they still seen as a good credit in that respect, if you see what I mean? So is the pricing competitive relative to other government institutions, or is it going to be slightly higher because it's local authority? Is there a credit assessment process? Is probably what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So there is a credit assessment process and a very rigorous one. Look, local authorities are not the same as universities. The divergence of the quality of universities is quite big. There is a distinction, big distinction with obviously the obvious names at the top, and we like to bracket the Russell Group. I think when it comes to local authorities, there is a increasing amount of discernment we have when we're assessing each individual local authority, because obviously there are instances where some have become technically insolvent. There are some capital directives, so we are quite careful about whom we lend to and on what scheme. I think the latter generally becomes more important. It's actually understanding the underlying scheme, because of course there are currently budgetary pressures at the moment, but think things change. 20 to 50 year deals, things change over a long time, but we have a hugely rigorous credit process, and we ensure that we are going into a transaction for the right reasons, because we take a long-term view. Excellent.
Okay, so just wrapping up, Shay, you've got a summary of why income strips are something that should be considered, and just to sort of close off the discussion really, because I think you've given us some good examples. You explained the income strip, how it works, and we've talked about some of the risks around the income strip process, but it'd be good for you just to sort of sum up, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem, and thanks a lot. Look, really, in summary, look, income strips are an opportunity for local authorities to work with institutional investors to finance, and with developers to finance and develop in borough regeneration schemes that may or may not happen. There is a an element of risk transfer to developer and contractor, and of course the capital is coming from an institution that is obviously paid back to the local authority over long term. And then I suppose the final point for me is that, you know, on the right schemes, the actual transaction can also provide a valuable cash flow above and beyond, you know, the rent and amount payable as the cost of debt or the rent to the fund. And also, you know, it gets things built. You know, a lot of these schemes can become viable in lots of parts of our country. So I think, you know, it's a interesting avenue to help with redevelopment and regeneration. But just to be clear, look, you know, this is not the silver bullet to everything. You know, I have conversations with local authorities where actually it turns out that this is probably not the right answer, and that's fine as well. You know, it has to be specific to the actual need of the underlying asset or the actual scheme. And as you sort of asked, Mark, you know, we could perhaps do something where, you know, we all work together and, you know, different pots of capital could be incorporated into the wider capital stack.
Yeah, and I think that's our view. You know, we income strips, we see them as there's a place for them in delivery of certain assets, but we understand that, you know, local authorities have got a tried and tested way of funding. This is potentially a new way of funding, and it's undertaking the due diligence and working out what the best way to provide the asset and the funding of the asset is. So that's where our role is probably to actually do the due diligence on the structures and, you know, look at the accounting and the economics of the structure. So that's great, Shay. Thanks very much for your time. I found it very interesting. I hope the people that have tuned into today's Trend in Treasury have found it equally as interesting. Any further questions we can take and we can discuss later on if you wish. But thanks a lot for your time, Shay. Thanks for listening in to Trend in Treasury. Next week's Trend in Treasury, we will be updating you in the next few days about the subject of that. But thanks a lot for your time, everybody. And yeah, thanks a lot, Shay, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much.